Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Sunday stream number 4. I'm so glad that all of you could be here to join us this wonderful Sunday afternoon. This is the Prudentialist, as always. I'm glad that you are all here once again to come in for your Sunday briefing on international relations and world affairs. Today, I have a very special guest with me, so instead of doing a normal PowerPoint presentation on various topics that we discuss and that we go over, I have with me today the editor of the up-and-coming Great Powers Journal, and I'm going to let him introduce himself. Mr. Editor, thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate it.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's been a lovely Sunday so far. I just got out of church, so I'm adjusting back to the somewhat less pleasant topic of this brewing conflict in Eastern Europe. But I hope to be able to present not so much the Western perspective, because I think we all more or less understand what the American foreign policy establishment thinks and has been doing regarding this conflict. So really, I want to just talk about both the Russian and the Ukrainian side in as neutral a manner as possible, just to give people a little bit more of a historical background, understanding the cultural factors involved, and hopefully just bring clarity to what is probably one of the most misunderstood low-intensity conflicts going on in the world right now. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. We're glad that you could come on. I'm glad that you messaged me yesterday evening wanting to come on, because I think it's great that we've got more people that are interested in talking about foreign affairs and international relations. I know when you messaged me, you had said that this is an area of expertise for you, or at least that you've done numerous bits of writing and research. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on your background and what about the Russian-Ukraine aspect of history or the politics that you know about so well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, without going into too much detail, Eastern European history and affairs I'd consider it probably my primary area of expertise. Includes living experience, language, studying the history of the region, having a decent familiarity with some of the cultures in the region. So yeah, that's kind of my forte. I guess that sort of came out if you've been reading any of the content we've been putting out on Great Powers Journal. Everything's about Eastern Europe. That was not intentional. I think what happened is we ran these interviews with people who have been in one form or another connected to the conflict, both on the Russian and Ukrainian sides. And I think everyone got very excited and started sending us more articles about Russia and Ukraine. So you will be thoroughly educated in Eastern Europe if you go take a look at our website.
Yes, and the link is in the description. So everyone who's not familiar with the Great Powers Journal, you should definitely be giving their content a read through. I myself have had a small piece published there, and a few other people's in our circles have also given submissions. So you should definitely be giving them a watch. And their Twitter account is great, because I saw you the other day blocking someone with pronouns in the bio. It was fantastic.
That was the least of their sins, to be honest.
Well, I figured with all that out of the way, I figured that we could get started, and I suppose we should start more so not focusing on maybe the Western NATO perspective, because we do know the American foreign policy establishments, go to issue on Russia. But I think it's important for us to take a look at some of the more the Ukrainian-Russian divide, because you do have very much, I would almost say on ethnic lines, the division between sort of pro-separatist and pro-Western forces in the region.
Well, that's true to some extent. But to really understand what's going on, you have to bear in mind that this conflict didn't start in 2014. It didn't start in 1991 when the Soviet Union broke up. It didn't start in the 1950s when the Soviet premier essentially gave Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic as a political favor. And that's not a judgment on either side. That's just more or less the reality of what happened. And it certainly didn't even start with the Russian Revolution. The Russian-Ukrainian historical confrontation has sort of ebbed and flowed. There have been obviously times when Ukraine, or Malorossiya, so Little Russia, as it's traditionally called in Russian, part of Russia at various points. At other times it was part of Poland, or whatever political entity at the time was, was in the form of Poland. So you really have to go back to the 17th century to understand where the origins of this conflict go. Now, I won't bore you with 500 years of history, but like I said, even the term Ukraine is in some ways politicized because, and this is getting into sort of Slavic linguistics, but the term Ukraine in Russian, Ukraina or Ukraina, means periphery. So the periphery of Russia, of the historical Russian territory and Russian nation. Now, obviously, if you're on the pro-Ukrainian side, you take issue with that because it's not very pleasant to think of your nation being referred to as periphery. And of course, the other term is Malorosia or Little Russia. That's not in a shorter sense, but it's every European, every major and some
I
other.
hate to interrupt there, but you're
No
cutting
problem.
in and out and roboting.
Am I? Huh.
Yeah.
Okay. Any better now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. Interesting. Wonder what might be causing that. But anyway, just to backtrack a little bit, being referred to as someone else's periphery is not great if you're a national.
Well, yeah. I'm going to try and carry through while there's some connection issues on your end there, Mr. Great Powers. So I'm going to continue on, and we're going to, while you try and get that fixed, I'm going to just go through and sort of talk about what we've recently been seeing in the last couple of weeks. So, like Great Powers Journal had said, like this conflict, of course, goes back, and the linguistic part that he brings up is important because the concern over Russia, especially, I guess, post-fall of the Soviet Union, post-dissolution in 1991, has always been about Russia's sort of iridescent claims, the periphery. And that's an important thing to realize because, as recent documents have shown in the between the United States and NATO allies, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, is that you've seen promises about NATO expansion that have been reneged on. And of course, this means that the Western powers have gone encroaching closer and closer towards Russia's borders, and in turn, sort of the iridescent territorial claims that Russia's historically had, both prior to the Soviet Union and during its times of empire, which of course has only led to more tensions that we see now, especially in Ukraine, as access to warm water ports like the Crimean Peninsula become all the more important for Russia's ability to project power. Mr. Journal, are you back?
I believe so. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hopefully we won't have any more
issues. I apologize for the technical issues. I'm not sure what seems to be the problem, but I will press on, and if I cut out, take it up for me.
Yeah, but, no worries.
Yeah, you were talking about, NATO expansion. And yeah, I mean, that sort of brings us to the modern origins of the conflict, because obviously when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, one of the immediate questions was not just, well, what do all the member republics do, but specifically, what do Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus do? Because Ukraine and Belarus both have been parts of Russia at one point or another. They were both, in their entirety, part of the Russian Empire, with the exception of one small part of Ukraine that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so now you had, on paper, three peer nations trying to sort out, the political arrangement they would have going forward. But in reality, you had Russia and two of its former territories negotiating this agreement. And so some of the things that came out of this agreement, Crimea remaining with Ukraine, and Eastern Ukraine in particular, which is majority ethnic Russian, majority Russian speaking, has historically been known as New Russia or Novorossiya. This is the Donbas that everyone talks about, the Donetsk and Lugansk regions that seceded in 2014. And so a lot of these questions were kind of just were kind of left unresolved, and the agreement deferred to the Soviet borders. Well, the Ukrainian SSR is just Ukraine now. The Belarusian SSR, well, that's going to be Belarus, the country going forward. So, from a sort of conventional, understanding of international affairs, where you have nation states that are all, supposed to be more or less legally on the same playing field, that made sense. But from a Russian historical perspective, it didn't. At least a lot of Russians, and to some factions of of Russian leadership. So that's how you ended up with this situation where borders don't quite align with ethnicities and languages and cultures, and that sort of set the stage for the escalation that occurred first in 2004, then in 2014, which led to, of course, the annexation of Crimea and the separation of eastern Ukraine.
And it is important to note that the United States has played a role in previous efforts inside there. I think it was the Orange Revolution in 2004 that the United States bolstered with significant pro-democracy U.S. aid programs into their area, which only had made the tensions between sort of the West and Russia even that more tense.
Right. Well, the West really didn't follow through on its promise to not expand NATO, not expand its sphere of influence. Obviously, as soon as the Warsaw Pact, the USSR and the Warsaw Pact, fell apart, all of these countries, Ukraine, Poland, et cetera, started receiving large amounts of, in various forms, aid and pressure, which inevitably comes with foreign aid, especially from the United States, pressure to adopt Western-style political norms, cultural norms, and to sort of prep themselves for the EU integration, which by that point had just been, was expected of European countries. It would be strange if, it was strange at that point to have European countries that weren't part of the EU. So they were put on that course, and that went, fairly straightforwardly in Poland and the Czech Republic and so on. Although obviously, that those countries are more resistant to the EU and to the West than the average European country. But it was much more complicated in Ukraine and Belarus, where there's a large, if not majority, Russian population that considers itself, if not Russian, then at least not Ukrainian to the point of separation from Russian identity. Hopefully that's a delicate enough way to put it. And so sort of just quickly installing the pro-EU, pro-Western software in these countries, if you will, was not as effective. Although 2004, obviously the United States helped that effort. And then, of course, in 2014, as we all know, the U.S. was closely involved in supporting the coup that deposed the relatively pro-Russian president and prompted the rest of the sequence of events that happened that year.
Which I think is a good transition now towards the Russian perspective, because to many people in the West, at least those who are more sympathetic is probably not the word I'm looking for, but or at least understanding of the Russian perspective, you have this relative 30-year period of Western promises being reneged on, and iridescent and peripheral territories that were once part of either the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire are now essentially allied, at least politically and economically, and by some extent with NATO expansion strategically, with your immediate geopolitical threat, which is of course the United States, and by extension sort of that Atlantic treaty cluster of countries. And so the 30 years pass, and they're on the doorstep, and here we are, which I think is an important perspective to keep in mind, at least for a more modern context when looking at the Russian view of things. So I think that's a good transition point to understand the Russian perspective with Ukraine.
Yeah, so I sometimes struggle to find parallels that would, one-to-one parallels between the Russia-Ukraine situation and, something equivalent in America. But it's sort of if the United States had been under a government that didn't necessarily represent the interest of the United States for close to a century, and during that time, Texas had been given away to, let's say, Mexico. And then when that period ended, Texas stayed with Mexico. That wouldn't really jibe with a lot of people because, Texas is in a lot of ways its own thing. It's got its own sort of distinct regional culture, much like Ukraine does. I don't want to minimize Ukrainian culture by any means, but it's also considered distinctly part of the historical American nation, right? Geographically and politically. So a lot of Russians were, basically thought the same thing. And for a while, Russian leadership and Russia as a whole just kind of let it slide. Both Ukraine and Belarus were kind of straddling the line because they couldn't or didn't want to go fully pro-West, but they were also, trying to set themselves up as independent nations, and that meant creating a certain amount of distance between themselves and Russia. So that, I would say, escalated, at least in Ukraine, that separation. Obviously, there was an increasing pro-EU, pro-NATO movement, which I think a lot of Ukrainians genuinely want. I don't know if they fully understand what it is that they're agitating for, but I think it's genuine. I think they see the relative success of nations like Poland and the Czech Republic, after they joined the EU and NATO, and they think, well, why can't we have this too? Now, they might be operating on outdated views of both what the EU and the United States are, but that's basically what's motivating the pro-Western faction of Ukrainians, at least ordinary Ukrainians. I don't want to speculate on what Ukraine's elite, what their motivations are, but obviously there was a growing faction of the Ukrainian elite that wanted Western integration, and after 2014, when pro-Russian elements were more or less purged from the military, the security services, and the government, that's now every faction, every ruling faction in Ukraine is at least anti-Russian and in many cases pro-European integration.
And with that, I'm going to share the map that I had put on for our thumbnail today, because I think it's important for people to sort of get a understanding of what we're dealing with. So here we have Ukraine and the two areas that great powers were discussing that have sort of are more ethnically Russian aligned, that are backed by separatist forces. And then, of course, down below, you have the Crimean Peninsula, which has been annexed by the Russian government since 2014. And, of course, the Crimean Peninsula has its own variety of historical importance. You, of course, have the Crimean War in 1856. It was a primary area of battleground in the Second World War. And, of course, it gives access for Russia to a warm water port that is necessary for naval projection that leads into the European continent.
Right. And, the naval base of Sevastopol has been it's been a Russian Navy base for centuries, and it's one of the most important, one of Russia's most important Navy bases. So when the events of 2014 kicked off, when the Maidan, or the revolution, kicked off in Ukraine, and it became clear that, it was going to go through, and there was going to be a new government, and the new government, started making noises that suggested that they were going to be more anti-Russian, and not just anti-Russia the state, but possibly, more hostile towards their own ethnic Russian population, restricting the usage of the Russian language in, state functions and in schools and so on and so on. The populations of at least Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk, and a few other places where there was no successful uprising. But in those three regions, people started to get nervous and people started to take various forms of action, whether it was just protesting or taking over government buildings, basically doing the things you do when you say, we don't want to be part of this anymore. So obviously, I think it's silly to deny that the troops that arrived in early 2014 in Crimea with no identifying patches, it's silly to deny that they were Russian. Obviously they were, but that was not the first thing that happened. There was organic anti-Ukraine escalation by the Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian population of Crimea that was one of the factors that led to the annexation. Obviously, Russia, if it wasn't in Russia's interest to do that, they, let's be real, probably would have left the population of Crimea to, hang out to dry. But, Russia's interest plus the agitation by the Russian population in Crimea combined to motivate Russia to take action and send in troops and more or less without firing a shot, take over the peninsula.
So with that being said, I think it provides a good way for us to segue into sort of discussing Russia's greater geopolitical aims and interests in regards to Europe and by extension dealing with the United States, because Crimea and Ukraine, of course, is just one small aspect of that, because Ukraine used to be an area in which a lot of Russian oil and gas would be transported through. There was an energy crisis in 2009 where the Ukrainians pretty much shut off the pipes, which of course gave greater influence and insistence for the Russians to, provide, pipelines to bypass Ukraine, which is where we get our Nord Stream issues between the United States and Russia. So to me, a lot of Russia's foreign policy interests in the continent, I think for me, at least my reading has been based on what George Friedman wrote in The Next 100 Years, that because of the expansion of NATO and American influence in the region, Russia is left right now to sort of play natural resource diplomacy. Russia's still rich in timber, rare earth minerals, natural gas, and oil, which are right now its primary, exports to Europe and by extension the rest of the world, which allows it to have some aspect of influence. And as we've talked about in the Nord Stream article that I put out on your journal, it's 40% of the EU's natural gas and oil comes from Russia. So they've been playing that effectively for quite some time. But to me, from my readings and my understanding of Russian history, which is probably not as detailed as others, but as someone who studied international relations in college, the Russian perspective has always been sort of having those sort of geopolitical buffer states, which of course have been taken away from them by NATO expansion, and to have a greater say at the table in the international community. I mean, it's still one of the larger military powers despite its declining population, and more importantly, it can still innovate on its own and has its own domestic manufacturing base, although it's not as much as it used to be. So to me, this is more of a show of force and more almost a flex, if you will, to demonstrate that Russia still has that power, has the ability to exert power, and it does have the advantage, at least, of having large swaths of Eastern European populations that identify to a certain degree as Russian, which can add to its territorial claims of, these iridescent territories.
Right. Well, yeah, natural resource diplomacy is certainly part of it, as is, the desire to demonstrate strength and have a seat at the table and everything you mentioned, because the Russian government is relatively non-ideological as illiberal democratic governments go. It's not as pronounced. The ideology is not as pronounced as, say, for example, in Poland or Hungary, where, especially in Hungary and to some extent in Poland, the government, respects democratic norms in one way or another. Whether it should or whether it's important is a different question. But they do emphasize that. But they also explicitly portray themselves as conservative, as standing against globalism and liberal values and all of that. Now, the Russian government will do that on occasion, but there are other factors at play that don't allow the Russian state, even if it, let's say, it wanted to, which is not clear that it does, even if it wanted to go full nationalist basically and say, this is the Russian nation, we represent the Russian nation, we're going to defend Russia's interests and the interest of ethnic Russians. Russia is relatively ethnically diverse, though not by the definition that we in the West are used to. What that means is there are lots of peoples in Russia that are treated, as distinct peoples with specific interests. Russian people, being majority, are obviously one of them. But until recently, they were sort of treated as default citizens. They weren't treated worse, but the level of influence that the Russian population commanded did not match the 70% or so of the population that it makes up. So the Russian state is not as ideological as, for example, Russian nationalists would want it to be, certainly. But there is an ideological component to it. And this brings us back to why Russia does what it does, in relation to Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe. And that is the idea of the Russian world. So Ruski Mir. Now, it doesn't mean that the entire world should be Russian or that the world should be defined by Russia. What that means is that there is a part of the world which is either Russian or should be part of Russia or affiliated with Russia in some form. And so it's hard to read, what the Russian state believes in, but it would certainly seem that ideology and its proponents are gaining influence within the Russian political establishment, because in 2011 there was a major increase in sort of nationalist sentiment in Russia that had to do with rising rates of crime by Central Asian immigrants and sort of the good times of the early to mid 2000s starting to wear off a little bit, economy going downhill a bit, and there was an upswing in not even Russian nationalist sentiment, but just Russian identity. And so that motivated, some Russian intellectuals and elites to adopt that ideology, or at least sort of approach it, which in turn put pressure on the Russian state to start doing things that appease, people who with a strong Russian identity, who believe in the idea of the Russian world. And so that's so that is another factor that led to annexation of Crimea, and then the varying levels of support that the two separatist republics have received since 2014.
And I think that's an excellent breakdown, and I think that's something that many Westerners and Americans don't recognize, especially because there is, that the ethnic and iridescent territorial claims that have been a part of either the Russian Empire or at least with the ethnic identity. Americans, especially the American foreign policy establishment, either fails to recognize these long-standing claims, and I think that goes back to the fact that Americans. My favorite statement I've heard growing up living abroad was always that Americans think that 100 years ago is a long time, and that Europeans think 100 miles is a vast distance. And I think it's because of our more or less lack of concept of just history and how far back that goes, especially when it comes to Russia and other European states, that, there's a very short-sightedness of the American foreign policy establishment when dealing with, say, these both with the Baltic states as well as the Balkans, is that we have these countries that, we think that are territorially, they've shifted towards to the West since the 1990s and onward. But as these two separatist republics will demonstrate, and as what Russia has demonstrated with this increase of its identity, has been that these, historical identities are not going away anytime soon, and they will play a significant factor in the years ahead.
Right. There's certainly a tendency among American foreign policy experts to think that history started in either 1991 or really either 2001 or 1991 or 1945, and no one really takes the effort to see what happened before that. So yeah, when countries like Russia start acting on historical claims, the only language that the American foreign policy establishment has is, the kind we're used to. Oh, well, they're invading a sovereign nation. Now, of course, America has done that a few times here and there, but that's still what's used. And Russia is not respecting Ukraine's sovereignty. Russia, there might be some human rights language thrown in there, which is amusing when you look at some of the factions of the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian armed elements, let's call them, that are fighting against Russia. So it's very inconsistent, but it's all that these people have. And that's not necessarily their fault. They've been taught to think a certain way, but it really does put a massive roadblock in the process of, if America's going to play, maybe not world police, but world decider, then it can't do that effectively if it doesn't understand or isn't taught to understand, historical trends that go back more than 70 years.
And to me, that's the great, and I think that also has to do, I don't know how familiar you are with Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, but his framework, of course, is that, rather than looking things from perhaps the nation state perspective, you need to look at things from more of a civilizational perspective. And an argument that he talks about there is that one of the greatest faults of sort of the Western liberal world order establishment that you see that gets established out of 1945 is that for them, history begins in 1945. And everything afterwards is to make sure we don't repeat the Second World War, and we make sure that such ideas don't come back. So our foreign policy of this like liberal universalism will begin to totally disregard everything that took place beforehand and everything that, led to the ideologies and, the civilizational worldviews of the countries that we interact with that aren't necessarily Western. And Russia, to me, of course, has been one of the greatest examples of that, because not only do you have 70 years of the Soviet Union being around, which of course was there before the war and after, but then the collapse of it is that all of a sudden that we think that, we can essentially de-Sovietify, like we did with the Nazis in World War II. And here we are. And to me, that's one of the greatest faults that the United States made, was being so aggressive in this universalism without necessarily recognizing that there was a unique identity, a unique politics, a unique culture, all of which, of course, now is one of the fundamental schisms between Russia and, by extension, the Atlantic and the West.
Well, it's funny you mention de-ideologization of any kind, because I would argue that the lack of a concerted effort to de-Sovietize by the Russian state after the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major blunder. I'm not suggesting that the West should have done that, or that America should have been involved in that process, because that usually has various side effects. But that the fact that Russia didn't really reconcile its Soviet past and tried to just move on, the new Russian constitution declared that Russia is the successor state to the Soviet Union. Sure, that makes sense just from a practical point of view. But there was no attempt to reestablish historical continuity with pre-Soviet Russia. No official large-scale attempt anyway. And so that's why you have this strange situation where, people in Russia who we might consider conservative or right-wing, also have nostalgia for the Soviet Union, which obviously, at least in its early decades and, more or less throughout its entire existence, was the opposite of conservative, right-wing, whatever you want to call it. But it's just because what people know, it's what people know. And it was a time of stability. It was a time of relative normalcy for most people. So you have that. And then, interestingly, you have the Ukrainian side occasionally weaponizing that. The various sort of political slurs that get thrown around, by each side at each other. Well, the Ukrainians will accuse the Russian side of, just being another iteration of the Soviet Union. They're the I'm not going to bother with the Russian words, but essentially the NKVD is coming. The Soviet army is coming to take us over again, and rob us of our nation and do what they did to us in the 1930s. And then you have the Russian side where, there's this passive recognition of the Soviet Union, but it's not like the current Russian state, is an extension of the Soviet Union. So it's leads to this ideological confusion on both sides.
Well, I mean, I'm familiar with Alexander Dugin's The Foundations of Geopolitics, his 1995 work, which kind of gives an outline of what Russia's been doing for the last 25, 26 years or so. And to me, the reason why I find so many Russian, what we would consider right-winger conservatives that are nostalgic for the Soviet Union is that you had a nation that, and it goes back to that Russian identity, that you had a nation that could project strength, project an identity, and keep things in relative order, even though they weren't great. But when we talk about like de-Sovietification, to me, from a realpolitik sense, my territories are gone. All these former Soviet socialist republics are now independent nations. To me, there isn't a strong desire to de-Sovietify because I can then use that existing network, infrastructure, and connections. I mean, even when we talk about like Nord Stream, which I'll eventually think we'll get into, I mean, even the first pipeline had various connections to former Soviet energy and FSB officials in the NKVD. So I don't see them getting to why they wouldn't. I mean, despite American efforts and Western efforts to open the country up and to get people, into some sort of a marketplace, the infrastructure was there for them to project power, at least in some aspects. So I can see why they wouldn't. I don't consider it that much of a blunder.
Well, then the other factor is that for a long time, Soviet nostalgia was kind of the only acceptable form of great power nostalgia that you could have in Russian society, because for a long time, basically starting with the end of the 90s, when the Russian security state and the Russian state in general both adopted some elements of what the Russian nationalist movement wanted, and also brought it to heel because it was too much of a competitor in some ways, because it was too powerful. Basically, they put limits on how much of a Russian nationalist you could be. So if you got too excited about Russian imperial legacy, or the idea of reclaiming historical Russian lands, or even if you got a little too excited about, let's say, the interest of ethnic Russians within Russia versus, say, other ethnic groups, and you were a little bit too militant about that, you'd get a visit, you would get in trouble. So the only thing a lot of people had was falling back on this, well, we were great, a few decades ago when the Soviet Union was still around. So like, what do you do? What do you do in that situation if you're an ordinary Russian? You weren't taught, if you grew up and were raised in the Soviet Union, you obviously weren't taught any Russian history, Russian imperial history that wasn't, portrayed in a negative light. So you were kind of stuck with this Soviet nostalgia. Now, I do think that's changing. I think the events of 2011 and 2014, introduced this idea that, maybe we do have this cultural heritage to draw on that's more than 100 years old. And so it's been interesting to see that slowly make its way into the decision-making process of the Russian state.
And I think which of course brings us to the Russian state itself, because so often we put a great amount of attention towards the, cult of personality that has been fostered around Vladimir Putin, and the fact that he has had legislation arranged to stay in power beyond 2036. But there's so much more that goes on behind the scenes of the Russian state that's not just Vladimir Putin, especially when you have a vast security network. Of course, Mr. Putin is a former KGB agent, but with an understanding in finance, which made him very prominent in his rise to power about fixing the Russian economy post-fall of the Soviet Union. But there's a lot more that goes on to that. I think that it's important for us to discuss, especially that you mentioned that aspect of Russian identity is now being a part of the Russian state, because so often the Western and American view of the Russian state is that you have strongman Vladimir Putin and then these oligarchs or these wealthy, either oil or mineral tycoons that, he sort of listens to. But there's so much more that goes beyond that most people just don't know about. And I think that would be important for us to discuss when we talk about the Russian state and how it operates.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that a lot of people in the West don't really consider when they think about authoritarian states or illiberal democratic states. And I think our audience is probably much better versed in this, but it still bears repeating that even authoritarian states are not, well, there's a difference between authoritarian and totalitarian states, and not just the level of control, but also the number of factions with power. So, Putin has various heads of industries to appease. He has various leaders of various ethnic groups to appease. That's why, for example, the sort of warlord of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, is so disproportionately visible in Russian politics, because he's kind of the best they got for keeping the region, relatively stable. And if that, unfortunately, that means doing him a lot of political favors. So, those and other factions are involved in the process of determining, which direction the Russian state takes. And for a long time, there wasn't really a nationalist faction. There was sort of a vaguely default, vaguely, conservative, vaguely patriotic faction that paid lip service to, the Orthodox Church, and paid lip service to Russian history and patriotism, and maybe sincerely cared about those things, but they weren't Russian nationalists. And so that's a relatively recent development, the emergence of those people.
Exactly, and there's so much in political favors, and sort of the leverage in which these individuals have plays a major role in the decision makings of the internal politics, as well as we had talked about earlier, with there being various peoples and identities, and of course that playing a factor even with the rising sense of a Russian identity, when even before 2011, when we're talking about issues inside Ukraine's color revolution in 2004, and then of course what happened in Georgia in 2008. So really, since I would say 2000 onward, that identity, and of course the relations between other peoples and who can help manage these various territorial aspects, plays a huge role in how the Russian government makes both domestic policy, but in also relations to its foreign policy as well.
A couple little things to consider for people to understand that balance in Russia. The Russian Constitution defines Russia as we would translate it as ethnically diverse state. A multinational state, meaning there are many nationalities, which means many ethnic groups. Because in Russia, the understanding is that nationality more or less aligns with ethnic group. That's one thing that in the West people either don't understand or are uncomfortable recognizing, the possibility of thinking of those things that way. But at the same time, the most recent round of the most recent changes to the Russian Constitution included the statement that the official language of being language of its nation-forming people. Now, it's a very roundabout way of saying that Russians are the defining people of Russia, right? And they couldn't just come out and say that because of all those different other factions that I mentioned earlier. But just the inclusion of that is, well, just even if it's purely symbolic, it's a huge break from what you expect a typical Western country to do. That the idea of including a statement like that is pretty much unthinkable outside of probably other Eastern European countries. So, but at the same time, until recently, you had effectively hate speech laws, which meant that if you got a little too fired up talking about the realities of immigrant crime in Russia, or relations between Russians and other ethnic groups, you could get in trouble. And that was decriminalized only relatively recently. And its decriminalization was another sign of this trend towards at least grudging, passive recognition of Russian national identity.
Well, speaking of various identities, I think that brings us back now to Ukraine and sort of what's been recently going on there. We've had sort of a breakdown recently of I believe it's called the Minsk Agreement, which was sort of the ceasefire, as tentative and tenuous as it is, from the conflicts of 2014, 2015. However, more and more Ukrainian troops have been recently killed by, Russian-backed separatist forces. I think 28 have been killed just up till last week ago. And now, of course, we've got an increase of Russian troops in the Donbas region. The access to the Crimean Peninsula, of course, is now being met with the Black Sea. Of course, U.S. and UK warships are heading towards the area. And it seems now that everyone is very poised for kinetic conflict. Although, as I've discussed on this channel, and I'm sure that in your pieces that has been talked about, you have an issue, of course, that there's no real win condition either for the Ukrainians or at least immediately for the West. Even the United States' own bean counters, like the Rand Corporation in 2016, 2014, and I think the most recent one was in 2018, was indicative of the fact that if something were to break out along the traditional Warsaw Pact NATO lines, at least geographically, NATO allies and the United States would be overrun in about 60 to 80 hours. Not to mention Russia's military and mobile artillery, so tank and armor emplacements, make it very easy for them to move. And the United States and her allies are essentially outgunned. Despite the fact that we've recently improved our military, posturing in the area, we've put more military bases inside Poland, we've increased funding in the area, and the Trump administration got that 2% increase in domestic NATO spending from her ally nations. But what comes to the question is, no one wants it, at least rationally, in my mind, nobody wants a hot conflict between two nuclear armed states, especially when Russia has sort of a first strike policy if its sovereignty is threatened. So the question sort of becomes, and I think this would be fun to discuss with you, is just what's the end game here? What is the Russian end game for the situation, and what's the Western end game?
Well, you were talking about win conditions, and that's a tricky question for the West, for the United States, because for the United States, the win condition is the destabilization of Russia. It's not clear how they'll achieve that if they, actively support Ukraine, give military support in the event of a conflict, because that would most likely unite Russian society behind, the Russian leadership, because obviously their country would be explicitly at war with the West, as opposed to in this back and forth, unclear confrontation. So it's really not clear who's in charge of deciding what America is going to do and what their motivations are. Like, it's not clear whether they're like anti-Russian but rational, or anti-Russian and irrational, and they'll go for they'll escalate indefinitely. And that's part of a broader problem of not really being sure who's in charge, within the Biden administration. But I think the rational people within the American establishment realize that it would not be in NATO's interest and in the United States' interest to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. And that's tricky for Ukraine, because they are really, really counting on NATO support. And they could, if they don't receive it at the critical moment, they could end up like Georgia. Georgia kind of went in expecting that NATO would back them, but then they either didn't expect a full Russian response, a military Russian response, and they maybe didn't expect to lose so handily to Russia. And then they realized that help was not coming from the United States, besides, angry denunciations of Russia on cable news. That was kind of all they were going to get. So I think Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky might end up in the same situation. And I don't know if Ukrainian leadership is aware that there's a pretty good chance that they're going to get left out to dry if they escalate too much with Russia.
And to me, that's why I find this situation so incredibly precarious, because there is a bit, in my perspective, and I guess if we're going to just start opining here, is that there is a bit of hubris in the American foreign policy establishment, and by greater extension, just sort of the establishment political class in general when it comes to this. Because the United States has been practicing regime change more or less since the Cold War, and if not before that, because there's about 100 years worth of history of the United States being involved in Central America, but that's a conversation for a later time. But to me, the best sort of description, I think, of what we're dealing with comes from this tweet from John Brennan last October, which I'm going to share on screen. John Brennan, being the former CIA director and ironically a former communist, describing that imagine the prospects for world peace, prosperity, and security if Joe Biden were the president of the United States and Alexei Navalny the president of Russia. We'll soon be halfway there. And of course, this was before the election, talking about sort of John Lennon's Imagine. And to me, this sort of is indicative of the hubris of the American foreign policy establishment, because it's just, that is a lot of power to assume that you can install a new leader in a nuclear armed state and in a country that is historically becoming more and more identitarian, that of course has had a historical animus with the United States. We fought a Cold War for over 70 plus years, and this is where we're at. So to me, this is the objective of, the American foreign policy. That's its win condition, which of course it's not going to happen. Navalny is in prison. He's on a hunger strike, according to international press. Apparently he's on death's door. Previous attempts to oust Vladimir Putin has failed significantly. His approval, whether you want to take any of those pollings with a grain of salt, still has him with a great deal of approval of the Russian people. And so the American win condition, apparently, like you had said, is the destabilization of Russia. And to Russia, playing defensively, I think for the first time, or playing defensively up until recently, in 2014, 2015, Russia has been playing defensively and sort of maintaining the sovereignty of its internal politics and its internal state. And now it's in a position, I think, to where it can flex itself and act offensively, both through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, because it would have greater leverage over European affairs through energy policy, and of course by squeezing Ukraine through both military and ethnic tensions in the region. But
Right,
of course, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say the Western fascination with the Navalny is really strange to me. And again, it shows a lack of understanding of what went on in Russia in the 90s and the early 2000s. Navalny, he went through many phases of being an opposition figure. He had a nationalist phase where he, was talking about, shooting Central Asian migrant criminals. He had a liberal phase. I think he's probably still in his liberal phase in terms of the kind of opposition he offers. But he's all over the map ideologically. And that's probably part of the reason why he enjoys relatively high support, because he's said everything at one point or another. And he does accurately identify, cases of corruption and that sort of thing in the Russian government. But before he became a serious political activist, I mean, he did just as much good stuff as any other influential person in Russia did in the 90s and early 2000s. So the idea that he's, this flawless, guardian of truth and justice, and the Russian state is irredeemably corrupt and crooked compared to him is just not true. He was an advisor to a regional governor. He's had plenty of influential positions. His family has a background in the security state. And what basically happened is, he became a full-time serious opposition figure, but there aren't any factions of the elite that back him, aside from the liberal media in Russia, which does exist and is fairly influential, but that's it. So this is something a lot of people, within our sphere have talked about, having at least one faction of the elites on your side to successfully pull off a regime change or just, significant political upheaval. That's just not there for Navalny. He for whatever, for one reason or another, he has not received that. So the idea that, the idea that somehow he's going to become the leader of this country and all of its power is completely delusional.
Yeah, and I mean, as the United States has learned in the last 25 years, if not more, is that we are, speaking broadly in the general sense with Americans, is that we are terrible at changing hearts and minds, especially when you're engaging with a country, or by extension a civilization, that has values and a history that are very much different and almost diametrically opposed to sort of the Western universalist interest that is, the proclivity of our foreign policy, especially with this current administration. Um, uh, the odds of you winning the hearts and minds to get Navalny on their side, yes, there's liberal Russian media, but when your biggest proponents are not your fellow countrymen, but say Rachel Maddow and the American Central Intelligence Agency, the likelihood of you, pulling that off is close to none. And as indicative by him being jailed, it's not going to come to fruition, at least with Navalny, I think.
Right. Yeah, we have this tendency, when we offer some foreign country a new leadership or new regime, we don't say this will be better for you because it's more in line with your interests. We say this will be better for you because it's more in line with the interests we want you to have. So at the same time as, we helped make the 2014 revolution in Ukraine happen, we were also pushing Ukraine towards EU integration, towards integration with the West, towards acceptance of Western liberal values. And that's very hard to pull off. I mean, you have to really, really totally, I don't want to say brainwash people, but you have to completely control the information space to get them to simultaneously change their preference for leadership and change their ideological preferences. And we just think that this time it'll work. And then when it doesn't quite work, or it works halfway, or one of those two parts works but not the other, you get these bizarre situations like in Ukraine, where you have a pro-Western government, but you also have very influential right-wing factions in the government that are extremely anti-Russia, violently anti-Russia, but also extremely anti-Western. They hate everything about the EU. They might want to integrate for economic reasons, but they hate, all the liberal values that they see the EU as promoting. And they're powerful, but they won't fit into the arrangement that America wants for a country like Ukraine. You know what I mean? So then the question is, well, what do you do with these factions? Let's say America gets what it wants. Ukraine becomes more aligned with the West, joins the EU, possibly joins NATO. But what do you do with the right sector? What do you do with the Azov regiment? What do you do with this large number of young men who are now armed and have military training and have organizational experience? And what do you do with the faction of the oligarchs that use those guys for their own purposes? That's not a question that America is equipped to answer and the West is equipped to answer, other than, well, we just make everyone accept liberal democracy. You know what I mean?
I mean, probably what would happen is the same thing that we've been doing, is just buy them out if possible. But even then, these people have funds, their own interests, and arms. That, like you said, this is a question that the West, even if it got what it wanted, I don't think that there's an answer to, simply because there are too many variables to consider. Not to mention that the very real likelihood of, either terrorism or insurgency is all the more than likely. We've seen this time and time and again in Afghanistan and Iraq. And of course, that would create a power vacuum. And it would, given the various ethnic identities that reside within Russia, its nationalities, I would very much presume that if the United States were to ever get what it wants, you would then see a identitarian conflict sort of break out within Russia's borders.
Sure. Just to be clear, I'm talking about Ukraine.
Sure.
Right sector is the largest right-wing faction in the right-wing party, broadly speaking, and its various militant groups affiliated with it to one extent or another are that sort of third element, that's not pro-Russian and not pro-Western, that would need to be co-opted or eliminated in one way or another. In Russia, I mean, it's very hard to predict just because of what a large country it is, but the effect of any sort of single swoop regime change in Russia, I think would be on par with the effect of the Russian Revolution and the civil war that ensued. I mean, it would be a complete, it would be a world scale disaster.
Yeah, and I don't think that is something that the world is remotely prepared for. To me, historically, as someone who's more amateurishly studied the dissolution of the Soviet Union, I think it is a miracle of the international community of what we managed to succeed in terms of the containment and the prevention of fissile material being leaked out or sold on the black market for what was accomplished from 1991 onwards. I cannot begin to imagine what nightmare scenario were to happen if that kind of conflict were to arise and say the West did get what it wants. There's no way I think that we have the means to control that material from being as contained as we did, 30 years ago. And that, I think, is the fissile and nuclear factor, I think, is something that a lot of people, when they look at this, do not put too much consideration into.
Yeah, and then something else when it comes to nuclear weapons that a lot of people in the West don't consider is that Russia has been relatively close to being ready to use them in relatively recent history. Now this is not 100% reliable, but numerous Russian sources have told me, including one that we interviewed, that in 2014, using nuclear weapons, at least on a tactical level, was on the table in the event that that NATO attempted to take Crimea and push the Russians out of Crimea. Now, that was a very unlikely thing to happen, a full invasion of Crimea. But had that happened, it seems plausible that that Russia would have considered using weapons of mass destruction.
Well, I mean, there's been a point now for at least, I want to say, 6-7 years now that the Russians have made it publicly known that if their territory is ever invaded or if their sovereignty is threatened, that they do have a first strike nuclear policy. Like they're not the United States where we'll respond if it's been used against us. But I wouldn't be surprised if that conversation was on the table.
Yeah, and in fact, it's now in the Russian Constitution, like the declaration of sort of territorial integrity of the Russian Federation is now in the Russian Constitution. So at least on paper, and any violation of that territorial integrity, including Crimea, and potentially in the future, including the separatist region of eastern Ukraine, would potentially invite that response, because that is that they've declared that an unacceptable, a fundamental unacceptable violation of the country's sort of principles.
So on the question of Endgame, there's been recent reports from Al Jazeera, France 24, as well as the Ukrainian government themselves, that there is potential for some kind of summit between the French, the Ukrainian, and the Russian governments that could happen as soon as tomorrow. And so I'm curious to see what will happen because, of course, as I'm sure as you may have known, have been keeping up on this, both Russia and Ukraine have been expelling their diplomats, and Russia's determining whether or not to determine the current Ukrainian diplomat in their country to be persona non grata or to, just have him dispelled with a statement. They claim, of course, that he's had access to classified materials from the FSB, which, of course, the Ukrainian government denies. But there may be a summit on Monday in France between Macron, Zelensky, and the various members of the Russian government. So as we've been talking about endgames, I would like to pick your brain and ask, if you're Russia and if you're Ukraine, what are you trying to do? I would assume, of course, rationally that the first object, of course, is to avoid a kinetic conflict. But from there, I mean, what concessions, I think, because Russia's in the position of strength and for leverage, what do you get out of it?
Well, if you're Russia, you have a few concerns. Obviously, at this point, Crimea is Russian. Just that's the reality. But making that, legitimizing that further, because obviously most of the world doesn't accept that. So taking steps, and I don't know what those would be, to get the rest of the world to say, okay, Crimea is part of Russia. We're not going to make that a sticking point going forward. Now, when it comes to Eastern Ukraine, I don't think it's in Russia's interest to formally annex it and to bring Donetsk and Lugansk republics into Russia and make them part of Russia. The approach that Russia has been taking is to basically give the residents of Donetsk and Lugansk Russian passports. Excuse me. And this, obviously this makes them Russian citizens, which means that Russia has a stronger claim for, protecting them, and also allows them to come to Russia, at which a lot of them have been doing because, yes, Donetsk and Lugansk and Eastern Ukraine in general, were and still are to some extent, a major industrial base, but 7 years of low intensity and not so low intensity conflict have made it unlivable for a lot of people. So it seems to me that Russia just continuing to give the Russians in the Donbas Russian passports and leaving them there either in this protected but unclear legal status, or just letting them come to Russia and just doing that until everyone who wants to be in Russia from there is in Russia, that seems like a reasonable solution for them, because that appeases the Russian nationalist element in the Russian state and Russian society, who care about these people because they're fellow Russians and want to see them protected in one way or another. But it also avoids, it doesn't let the West keep playing this violation of territorial integrity card that they would immediately play, and they would immediately make a big deal of if Russia formally annexed the Donbas. So that's for when it comes to Russia. When it comes to Ukraine, it seems to me, based on the interviews we've done and just generally observing the issue, that most Ukrainians kind of accept that Donetsk and Lugansk are not coming back. Some of them don't even really want them to come back because they've seen the very strong pro-Russian sentiment that emerged there, and they're concerned that those people will remain as a sort of pro-Russian fifth column in Ukraine. So, Ukrainian commentators and observers have been talking about, the need to prevent that from happening, and for Ukraine, continuing to allow Russia to turn those people into their citizens kind of solves that problem, because then there are fewer people that they have to care about in the Donbas, and but they also can continue using it as a talking point indefinitely. They can talk about how Russia took our territory forever, but they also don't have to worry about either the massive consequences of an armed invasion of the region, or the more sort of drawn out consequences of attempting to reintegrate that region into Ukraine. So for Ukraine, Ukraine wants probably to maximize the amount of American and EU support it receives without going too far and being too aggressive and then losing all of it in one stroke, when America and Europe realize that they're going to get into a war with Russia. And then for Russia, it's, as I mentioned, securing the legitimacy of Crimea and acquiring as much of the population resources of the Donbas without formally annexing it.
Well, between the proposed summit between those three parties that could potentially happen tomorrow, and of course the American administration calling for a summit between the United States and Russia over Ukraine and, by extension, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, I am very curious to see as to what will happen next, and as to whether or not there will be some sort of agreement for the United States and Russia to ease the tensions between the two nations, and of course what's going on in Ukraine. I think that your analysis about what Ukraine wants is very accurate. I think it's important to recognize that those two, republics aren't coming back. I don't think that they'll get Crimea back either. That port is too important to the Russian military to project power into the sea, especially when they've essentially closed it off as the American and UK warships are getting closer. But I think it will be important, especially with this administration, to approach things in a conciliatory nature, but it won't happen, unfortunately, given the American media establishment and its political class being very anti-Russia for the last 4.5 years, courtesy of finding an easy political target of the previous administration. And of course, I guess to save face from the 2012 presidential debate when Russia was called America's greatest geopolitical foe, and the Democrats, Barack Obama had laughed that off. And so I think that there's this sort of overcorrecting course correction from the American political establishment. I think that Russia's not the greatest geopolitical threat or concern to the United States. I think that's the Chinese. And as I've said before on this, on other videos and streams I've done when talking about foreign policy, I think the mistake of NATO encroachment and, making Russia feel threatened has pushed away a very great power and a potential ally to what I think will be the greater civilizational concern, which is between the West and the Chinese in the coming years. But that's a conversation for another time. But we're a little over an hour in, and I would like to open up the discussion for questions from chat. This has been a very popular stream. I think we had a peak of 80-something people watching consecutively. So this was a fantastic Sunday stream. I'm so glad that everyone could come by. So if you guys have any questions, while I still have the wonderful editor of the Great Powers Journal here, we'd love to take any questions that you guys have.
Do we have any lined up at the moment?
We had there was one earlier that was lined up that I thought I would ask you. So let me pull it up here real quick.
Sure.
But again, I'm glad that you were able to come on and said that you wanted to. This was a very good and informative conversation. People were quite happy with it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, that's the reason I started the publication, is that I felt that there wasn't a publication specifically devoted to explaining foreign affairs without putting everything through sort of an American lens, whether that's an American conservative lens or, an American liberal lens. I thought there needs to be somebody who just explains what's going on in at least the Western world and the world as a whole from the perspective of the places where it's happening. Seems kind of obvious, but it's something that I feel like American foreign policy journalism has more or less abandoned, because everything is viewed through this filter of American establishment values, let's call them, and American establishment interests. So yeah, that's what I'm here for. So what was the question?
So the first question is why does there seem to be such a Western hatred towards Russia? I know that's rather broad, but I guess to contextualize it, I mean, it doesn't help that the American media, and by extension the Western media, has done its best to play Russia as sort of this, authoritarian, tyrannical state. But I think it does. It's a good question to ask why do we have, this animus when in reality they're a very powerful country?
Yeah, it's certainly a broad question, but there are a few different factors you can talk about. One is sort of restarting of Cold War era inertia, because obviously, in 1991, you had a giant class of academics and, national security experts and other people who, whose mission in life was to understand the Soviet Union and, help combat the Soviet Union in one form or another. So when that opportunity went away, and when the American national security establishment started pivoting towards the Middle East and towards the war on terror, a lot of those people, they didn't leave the American national security establishment, but their forte was not being played to. So I think when 2008 happened and everyone could start talking about Russia again, and Russian expansion and all that stuff, and then especially when 2014 happened, and the American national security establishment started pivoting towards the Middle East and towards the war on terror, a lot of those people, they didn't leave the American national security establishment, but their forte was not being played to. So I think when 2008 happened and everyone could start talking about Russia again and Russian expansion and all that stuff, and then especially when 2014 happened, I mean, that was Christmas come early for all of these people, because it meant that their particular field of expertise and the thing they had, the thing they had done for decades in intelligence agencies and the Department of Defense and the military, et cetera, was now relevant once again. So that's one part of it. Another part is that a large portion of the American media that covers Russia and American sort of think tank establishment that covers Russia and a lot of the American defense establishment is made up of people who are from Russia or from Eastern Europe, who either came here, either their ancestors came here before the Russian Revolution, or they came here, they're Russians and they came here during the Russian Civil War, shortly after, and so they're motivated by anti-Soviet sentiment. But both of those are increasingly, obviously just because of the passage of time, becoming less relevant. But you do have a class of people that have some connection to Russia or Eastern Europe, but for one reason or another have this ingrained resentment of Russia or any other Eastern European country. They kind of act the same way towards Poland and Hungary and everywhere else. And so that obviously informs the way they cover Russia, the way they talk about Russia, the plans they make towards Russia. So I think that's the in a nutshell explanation.
Yeah, and
also,
I think
confronting China is hard. Confronting China is potentially something the United States will not be able to do effectively. Like there's a good chance that we'll fail to prevent China from becoming the number one world power. We might, but we might not. So Russia, in a lot of ways, is a little bit easier to tackle, and so that might be diverting some of the intensity towards anti-Russia sentiment, because it's potentially we could defeat Russia. The Western liberal global order could defeat Russia. I don't think it could defeat China.
No, and I've said on previous Sunday streams is that if the United States wants to contain Russia or to contain China in any sort of traditional, power, like if you look at like power transition theory, if you're someone who subscribes to AFK Orgnansky's work, like conflict is very likely between, what is considered the transitioning power and the rising power, the United States and China. To me, if you want any sort of successful containment or to beat them at their own game, so to speak, I think you need the Russians. And right now, with how things are, that Russia's not going to be on board with whatever the United States or the West wants to do in containment, because right now China is, at least on paper, supportive of anti-Western and by extension Russian interests, which makes things difficult. But I do agree with you, though, that the Cold Warrior, academic class never went away. It became a part of the American security and media establishment, where there's been a history of the American, media having a relationship with, the intelligence, sector, from Operation Mockingbird to what we have now. So I'm not surprised that, and even George Friedman, who I cited earlier, had predicted, that there would be growing Cold War II sentiments from the American political establishment, and that would be pushed, especially as Russia feels encroached by the United States and NATO. And so,
one thing that's worth noting is that the Cold Warrior establishment it's fading. The intensity of it is still there, and it's being passed on to the new generation of sort of anti-Russia activists and journalists and security establishment type people. The intensity is still going to be there, but the seriousness and professionalism, I think, has declined. So that's potentially dangerous, because you have people who are just as fired up about opposing Russia, but they might not necessarily understand why, and they might not necessarily have rational motivations for doing so. And that is not a recipe for, reasonable solutions.
So the next question we have, and I'll put it up on screen here. How much capability do you think Turkey has of pushing for an intensification regardless of the Ukrainian reticence, given the assumption of desire for proxy war against Russia?
So I assume I assume that's referring to intensification of Western aggression towards Russia. So I'll answer that, and I'll tackle another possibility. I'm not sure whether Turkey really wants significantly worse relations with Russia. I mean, obviously they've clashed in recent history and in not so recent history as well, but there are still a lot of ties between Turkey and Russia, whether that's Russian tourists going to Turkey, which is declining, but it's still a thing. And, Turkey not really being aligned with the rest of Europe and the rest of NATO on a lot of things. I think that will keep them from, trying to push for all-out conflict with Russia. Because obviously, Turkey is in NATO because we need them, and they're in NATO because it's convenient for them. But Turkey is not a European country. It's not a Western country the way, well, most of Europe is. And they have different motivations. Their leadership has different motivations. I think their leadership thinks more like Russia than the leadership of Russia, than like the West. So yeah, I don't see Turkey having a pivotal role in this confrontation. So I do know what the person asking the question is referring to in terms of Turkey sort of supporting Ukraine in some ways, and obviously being a NATO member, but I don't think it's going to be a deciding role.
Yeah, and I mean, as I discussed last Sunday about sort of Erdogan's leverage over the EU when it comes to negotiations, that they've moved more closer towards Russia's sphere of influence politically. I mean, they've gone from shooting down Russian aircraft at the earlier years in the Syrian civil conflict to where they're now buying more and more Russian weapons and are having more, an increase in diplomatic communication between Erdogan and Putin's government. So, I mean, yes, Turkey nominally is a NATO ally. Turkey nominally is aligned with the West out of convenience for the security apparatus that comes with it. But I think as we've seen from, migrant diplomacy to the insistence from the EU and the United States on human rights, that you're seeing, again, that sort of ideological and identitarian clash between sort of Western human rights liberal values and the sovereignty and the political identity of a country like Turkey or Russia, which pushes them closer together.
I mean, Turkey and Russia throughout their history have been forced to live with each other. Obviously, they fought with each other. The Ottoman Empire fought the Russian Empire, but they were forced to, they couldn't, they weren't fighting the whole time. They had to find a way to coexist because their empires brushed up against each other. So I think that understanding that they're two, relatively rational powers with relatively rational motivations will win out over Turkey's desire to stay on good terms with the West.
Let's see here. The next question, I think this one will be pretty easy to answer. Assuming war did go hot between Russia and Ukraine, NATO did not intervene, would Ukraine even have the slightest chance of winning such a conflict? And I think
next question. No, I'm kidding. No, it's a reasonable question. Because obviously the war, the fighting that went on between the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian militias, and then the pro-Russian militias and, possibly Russian conventional forces in eastern Ukraine, it looked on the surface, it looked like two, relatively equal forces fighting. There was a relatively limited amount of armor involved. It's kind of ragtag on both sides. The Ukrainian military in 2014 was very, very poorly equipped. You had the classic problem of, people fighting, people who, from the next town over, so to speak. You had Eastern Ukrainians fighting, Eastern Ukrainian Russians, and people on both sides. Although I guess more Ukraine saying, I don't want to do this. What's in it for me? I'm just killing people who aren't that different from me. So, Yeah, back then that looked relatively equal, and also because Russia couldn't afford to just send in a tank division and steamroll the Ukrainians out of eastern Ukraine. Right now, Ukraine has had 7 years and 7 years of assistance from the West to rearm and build up its military. So Ukraine is much better equipped now. I think Ukraine went through the sort of oh shit modernization process that Russia went through in 2008 when they kind of botched the 2008 war despite winning. They took more casualties than a serious country would take against a country like Georgia. So I think Ukraine had that moment, and they'd be better equipped, but they would not stand a chance. They could maybe fight the Russian military to a halt and basically make it slow and costly enough that domestic opinion in Russia would force the Russians to withdraw or to reach a settlement. But purely in terms of on military terms, no, it wouldn't even be close. Even though technologically they're more or less on the same level, more or less.
Yeah, I think to me that question has to be looked at as to what would be the Ukrainian win condition. And to me, the Ukrainian win condition would be to draw them to a stalemate and sue for peace, because I don't think that you can outright win an offensive military conflict against the Russians. Like, well, yes, there's been substantial modernization efforts. Yes, they've received billions of dollars in Western aid, especially for anti-tank and anti-personnel weaponry. The other thing to consider, of course, is the air advantage that the Russians have. And this, of course, is assuming with the question that NATO doesn't intervene. And at that point, the Russian Air Force would, I would think, play a decisive role in that factor. But no, it's a good
absolutely.
question. Yeah,
the
it's
Russian
a very
Air Force
good
could
question.
hit anything in Ukraine that they wanted to, if they really wanted to.
Yeah, despite American anti-air defense systems being sold to them for the last 6 years, I don't think that there's enough that the Russian Air Force could steamroll them. But the next question is from DC perspective. How does economics play into all of this? Is the Russian GDP to debt ratio anything for them to be concerned about?
So I'm not an economist. I don't claim to have any particular economic expertise, but what I can say is that Russia is more economically resilient than the Western press lets on. Obviously, they have serious economic issues, shrinking population and all the things that come with that. They don't have the industrial capacity they used to, although you could say that of many countries, Western and otherwise. But Russia, probably since the early 2010s, when they realized that the reset in relations with America wasn't really working out, and especially since 2014, when the sanctions hit really hard, they have been building up, their reserves, just reserves of money to, subsidize their citizens if things really went to hell. They've been trying to, sort of nationalizing their financial system a little bit, enough that in a crisis situation, they could basically say, okay, you need to, tell their banks and tell their financial industry, okay, you need to start doing things in the national interest. They have the tools in place to do that. So at least in that respect, they're better prepared than they might seem, despite their very real economic issues.
And I just looked it up. Apparently, Russia's debt to GDP ratio is incredibly low compared to other Western countries. I believe Russia's debt to GDP ratio. Russia's government debt now accounts for 17.8% of Russia's gross domestic product. Its total government debt was $257 billion, according to Russia's audit chamber on February 24th, 2021, which is unheard of compared to other Western countries whose debt to GDP ratios are incredibly high. So in terms of how that affects anything is that there's room for an increase in domestic spending and not so much for any sort of, you're not likely to see its financial, obligations from the government being played upon. If there were to be a conflict, that's something that gets talked a lot about, U.S. and, sort of Chinese engagements, is that there's the financial aspect that would be played as a factor, but Russia doesn't have that much of a problem. The question is, as great powers had mentioned, like there's been efforts to nationalize, there's been efforts to move further and further away from, dependency upon the dollar. So I don't think that it will play too much of a role, especially its debt, in part because you have to keep in mind Russia has been more or less cut off from at least sort of quote unquote the West, right, through international pressure and sanctions for years now. And they've been doing, and they're not, I can't say they're doing fine because sanctions do have an impact, but they've managed to hold their own and survive and create a relatively robust domestic, market free of sort of external pressure. Throw in their natural resources like oil and liquid natural gas, you would be in a strong position to hold your own if need be. So it won't play too much of a factor in terms of its debt.
Although escalated sanctions, like if America and the West really went all out with sanctions on Russia, it would be there would be a huge impact on the Russian economy. That's worth keeping in mind.
Of course. But again, like we had talked about, like I mentioned in the piece submitted with Nord Stream, is that if you were to go all out with those sanctions, you would see significant political tension between the United States and many European countries in the West.
That's true. That's true.
So there's things to keep in mind, that there's the domestic diplomatic relations between the variety of these countries involved. Let's see here. Let's get another question up on here. I have a question, I guess, oriented towards me, is what will America do about Germany? I guess maybe, are we referring to, Germany's desire to have the Nord Stream 2 pipeline happen, or at least Angela Merkel's? I guess, to be honest, it's a very rock and a hard place for the United States to do anything with Germany because, one, you've had 4 years of strained relations between the United States and Germany from the Trump administration and Angela Merkel, which, of course, the Trump administration sort of kickstarted already a more long-standing trend of a European identity that comes out of the European Union, or sort of the European project. So we're seeing more of a push for a European Union standing military rather than a reliance on NATO. You're seeing more and more of a clampdown politically on sort of the right-wing movements inside inside Germany. So, like the AfD right has been recently had the German security state sort of take a look into what it does in terms of domestic terrorism, despite the fact that they're growing in popularity as a national party. So it's very tense, and not to mention that the German government has, or at least its localities, have set up foundations to bypass American sanctions if need be on the Nord Stream pipeline itself. So I think what will happen, at least with the Biden administration, given their proclivities of, the whole America is back mentality and its desire to be realigned with sort of the traditional neoliberal world order that we saw from, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, I think that it will be more conciliatory in tone, but I think that their hardline position on Russia will make that incredibly difficult to accomplish.
Yeah, and I would just say that I think there's a good chance that the Biden administration will overplay their hand and push Germany too hard, and Germany will say, what, back off. We have our issues with Russia, but we don't have this, fanatical hostility towards them. And you guys are starting to mess with our arrangement with Russia, and we're going to be taking further charge of the European side of the relationship. And I think that could lead to, in the longer term, not a more pro-Russia Germany, but a less pro-America Germany.
Well, I think that's a good answer for both of us there on that one. He did say, I meant that question for the both of you. Okay, well, good to know. I just figured that you added me for it. Another question would be on that issue is, should there be no war in Ukraine, do you think the Nord Stream 2 will be completed? I'll let you answer that one first.
Well, of course, ideally, there should not be a war in eastern Ukraine. I mean, what I understand that sort of among the audience that's, say, to the right of the Republican Party, there are two camps. One that's to varying extents pro-Russian because they see Russia as sort of an alternative to the liberal world order, and a pro-Ukraine camp which sees Ukraine as a maybe conservative nationalistic Eastern European country similar to Poland or Hungary or what have you. But none of that outweighs the massive catastrophe and tragedy of two peoples with very similar cultures, languages, faiths, etc., killing each other. So no, ideally, of course, there should not. That I don't think we want a full-out armed conflict to resume. Now, when it comes to Nord Stream 2, yeah, I think it will. I'm not quite as bullish on it as someone like Darren Beatty. If you've seen any of his tweets, I think half his brand is like taunting American diplomats about how Nord Stream 2 will be completed. But yeah, I think it will. I think the various German industries that want more Russian natural gas, and even the German government that is going to get sick of America telling it what to do. I think those two forces, plus obviously the Russians wanting it completed, yeah, I think they'll get it done, whether America wants it or not.
Yeah, and not to be full on, because Darren Beatty is definitely that is half his brand. I think every other tweet is adding someone in the U.S. State Department that Nord Stream 2 is going to happen, whether they like it or not. But I agree. Yeah, no, there should there be no war, and I hope that there isn't, because like we had discussed earlier today, there's just so many factors that aren't considered in an actual hot kinetic conflict. Whether it's the nuclear concerns or, of course, the fact that NATO doesn't really stand a chance. I think that the fact that, one, that the German government, at least until now, is still wanting the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to happen. And if there is going to be conflict in Ukraine, or still at the very least tensions or a breakdown of the Minsk agreement, what existing oil and natural gas that is exported through the Balkans in that part of Ukraine will most likely see either A, be a target, or B, you'll see a reduction in output, which puts more emphasis on the pipeline itself, which would probably give the government to behoove itself to get it completed. And of course, yeah, I think the American pressure will backfire. The Biden administration will overplay their hand, because at the current point in time, the Biden administration does not have the political capital to spend in Germany or on Germany, especially because of the strained relations between the two countries over the last 4 years, and the greater sense of European identity and creation of sort of a European military, which, if you're a Eurosceptic, that's terrifying to think about, but it's a very real policy proposal from both the German and French government. So I do think that it will happen, and not to say it's inevitable, as Darren Beatty would say, but it's very likely that it will be completed. And I think it would be in the United States' best interests to let it happen as sort of a diplomatic, concession. But I have more to say about that in a future piece, hopefully, that I'll submit to you later.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
Wonderful. So another question, also on conflict. If there is a war, is there a future for Ukraine, win or lose? And I guess I guess that question is probably more so, does Ukraine as a country as we know it exist?
Does it or will it? Because does it is a can of worms that I don't think we want to open on this stream.
No.
No, absolutely not. Yes, I don't think it's likely that even if there was a full-out war between Russia and Ukraine, I don't see Russia, going in and retaking all of Ukraine. I don't see, the Russian tanks in Kiev, as Russian nationalists like to put it. I see Russia moving very aggressively to secure the Donbas, and then potentially some other regions bordering that, maybe Odessa, which is not, which doesn't border that region, but it's another very Russian region of Ukraine. So I see them moving very aggressively to secure those areas, and then not going further, because there are sort of levels of setting off Western aggression. Obviously, invading Ukraine, as the West sees it, would set that off. But going past the pro-Russian territories that have already seceded, that would be an exponentially larger escalation as from the West perspective. So I think they would steamroll the Ukrainian military in Donetsk and Lugansk, and then force some sort of peace from a position of strength.
So he expands on it. He says, I mean, will it simply collapse into a basket case, economically, demographically, etc., no matter if they win or lose?
That's a good question. So if there's a war and they lose, they might find themselves in a Georgia type situation where a lot of the Western support just leaves because it's going to become too costly for the West to continue propping up Ukraine. So at that point, they have a few options. I mean, one is just try to go it alone and accept the loss, maybe try to win, secure Western support in another way, not so much through NATO integration, but maybe through, EU integration without NATO, something like that. But that's pure speculation on my part. This isn't entirely answering the question, but I hope it contributes. And this is something that I think it would make more sense for Ukraine to do regardless, but certainly if they lose to Russia and they want to survive as Ukraine and not just as a sort of a American vassal rump state, is to go to the Visegrad countries, go to Poland, Hungary, Czechia, and say, we want to align with you primarily, and by extension, the European Union, but primarily with you guys, because the interests of those countries are way closer to that of, let's say, the pro-Ukrainian side of Ukraine, than the interests of the EU are. And there's a subset of Ukrainian nationalists who see Ukraine as part of this, I guess you could say, revived and expanded, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where you have the Slavic countries of Central and Eastern Europe banding together, which is already happening to some extent, but that would seem like a more reasonable course of action for Ukraine than just trying to become a generic EU country. And it's something they could do that would allow them to retain an identity, of some sort, without totally just being taken over by the EU and by America.
Yeah, I mean, if win or lose, right, I don't think that a complete collapse, failed state scenario is likely. There's too much of a vested interest from both Russia and the United States, I think, to let that happen. Not to mention the fact that you've got the economic factors like the petrodollar, for example, about oil and liquid natural gas being transported. You have access to ports. I don't think that you'll see a complete collapse. I mean, if war is to happen, I mean, there might be a demographic issue, but as we've noticed that any time that there's an armed conflict, even when there are casualties, you sort of get a slight population increase after the war ends. And economically, I do agree with great powers over here that it would be in their interest, I think, to align sort of with the nationalist idea that comes out of that old, Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth kind of idea, especially as Poland and Hungary become more and more louder voices inside, the European project, even though they're much to the, thorn in the side of, France and Germany and Italy for migrant concerns. But they are becoming more of a major player, and I think that would be wise for them to align their interests as well. But I think that is it for questions. Although David Johnson says Russia has nothing but time, they will probably do like China with Hong Kong and wait to make the moves when the United States is not willing to push back.
That's a good point. Russia has much more time. The Ukrainian government does not. President Zelensky's approval rating is, last time I checked, somewhere around 30%. Even people who are hardcore pro-Ukraine, pundits and journalists and, a lot of sort of political figures also criticize him relentlessly because they don't see him, they don't think of him as doing a good job. So the Ukrainian government has to pick an option and pull the trigger on it, or else internal discontent is going to catch up to them and no one is going to want to help them.
Yeah, Russia has all the time in the world. Its stability and continuity of government will last a lot longer than the fledgling democracy that is inside the Ukraine.
For sure.
Yeah. But no, I think that's it for questions. So with that being said, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to let you shill for a little bit about the publication and why you wanted to do it and get started. And I'm going to put it on screen so everyone can find it and take a look.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Yeah, like I said earlier, I was inspired by, some of the newer publications out there that cover domestic politics, like American Greatness and American Mind and so on. But they obviously focus on domestic politics. And I thought, there's something missing here. There's no dedicated resource not even for covering, politics or international politics from a conservative or whatever perspective, but just explaining world affairs without that, without any American lens, or as little as possible. So obviously, we're going to talk about how, world events affect the United States, but it's really less about trying to say, here's what should happen in X part of the world, and more, here's a better way to understand what's happening in that part of the world. So yeah, I mean, this is all very big talk, but we've been around for all of a week and a half now. But we had an excellent launch, and I appreciate all the support, and we'll be putting out more reports, maybe some more interviews. Going to start branching out from Eastern Europe, because obviously that was in the headlines, and our interview series, which really, if you're going to read anything, please read those, because those are people who on both sides really, really care about their countries and the future of them. And I think that's probably the most valuable perspective, more so than anything the Russian or the Ukrainian or the US government says. So yeah, if you're going to read anything, check those out. Other than that, yeah, we appreciate all forms of support. I think there are Prudentialists. There are a couple tabs that you can click on. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, we appreciate any form of support, and we also welcome people who want to try their hand at writing and covering foreign affairs. Shoot us a message on Twitter. We've had some excellent contributors, including, of course, my friend on the stream here, and we'll have a few more guests being published in the next few weeks.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. And yes, like I had said, or like he had said, that they've only been around for about a week and a half. They're growing. They've got over 100 followers on Twitter. You should follow them on Twitter. And of course, you should follow them at their website and support them if you can. And
we're
like
also
I said,
on Substack.
They're all on Substack as well.
Yeah.
No, I think I showed that earlier, that you can put your email in there for Substack if you use that service. And yeah, they will let you try your hand at writing. Like I have my little regional report here on screen, so I'll be sort of submitting an opinion, more policy based on them later. But no, if you're interested in this sort of stuff and you want a perspective that's not necessarily blanketed by, this sort of traditional American foreign policy establishment perspective that you see in other journals, this is a great publication. And there are some people on there that have already written. The interviews are fantastic. And the other gentleman who submitted a regional report, Kevin, who I met through a Apostolistic Majesty stream, he's an instructor in international relations, and he works within the classical realist framework. And he's an excellent guy. So by all means, you have some really great perspectives, and it's a great publication. You should support them.
Well, hey, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate getting the opportunity to go into some of this stuff, and always happy to come on if there's something I can something I can contribute to.
Well,
so yeah, thanks again, and
This was definitely our best stream to date. You were a fantastic guest. So if there's ever an opportunity where you want to come on, or if there's something that's you'd like to discuss, or you have some subject matter experience on, you are more than welcome to come back.
Well, I appreciate it very much. Thanks again. Take care.
No problem. Take care. Well, guys, I'm glad that you all enjoyed the stream. This was a fantastic Sunday afternoon. So I have some shilling and some announcements, and I guess I'll just catch up with you guys now that the hardcore stuff has been gone over. So in a little bit, because I have everyone's attention right now, I will be on Mr. Patriarch's stream later this afternoon. I'll be talking about what is to be done. I will be on there at 3 o'clock Central Time, so in about 25 minutes, I'll be over there talking about, strategy and things like that. So it'll be a fun conversation. So I've got that going on. That'll be in 25 minutes on Mr. Patriarch's channel, and I will put a link in the chat for all of you to follow along. So let me put that in the chat for you guys. And Fabrizio, I don't have Discord. I'm already on Twitter, and I'm got this YouTube channel. I'm trying to get on Minds and Gab and all that other stuff. So I am I don't have a Discord channel, although I will put a poll out for the subscribers. If you guys want one, I'll set one up. I don't think that'll be that big of a deal. I will just need some moderators for it, though, because I try and limit my screen time so I'm not on my phone or on my computer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But if you guys want one, I'll look into it and I'll make one for you guys. But yeah, so I'll be honest with you all. I've been in a rut lately for scripted content. I want to put good stuff out for you guys and good takes and things that I think are important to talk about and analysis. So for instance, like last week when we did the consequences of working from home video, even though like the comments were like mixed reviews, or like, it was like 50-50 of like, yeah, this was a good take, or others that are like, no, working from home is awesome. I was more happy with the fact that you all had something to comment and had your opinions to say. Greatly appreciate that. So trust me, I significantly appreciate the feedback. To me, feedback is more important, I think, than the clicks or the view count, because for those of you that care enough, that means that y'all's opinion to me, you think it's worth giving, the opinion and all that, and I appreciate it. I'll probably look into making a Discord, and if Mark, you're open to modding, then I'll probably make one for you guys. You're right, it is a good way to network. I do a lot of my network though on Twitter. DC, thank you for stopping by. I greatly appreciate it. But I will have, I do have like a script written, and it's sort of talking about, closing out the exits and what we're dealing with in this sort of as a service economy, and how, not only are we dealing with physical exit being cut off from the regime, but we're also now seeing financial access as well. And we're talking about things like, taxing vehicles for how many miles they've driven, electric cars. I might just make it a Monday morning musing just so I have content to put out there. It just depends. But I've been dealing with some IRL stuff about trying to arrange with this new job that I might be taking, which I want to take. It's just there's some logistical stuff behind it that is causing a ton of stress on my end, which is what has really sapped the energy out of me. But I'm trying to overcome that. But, between balancing a full-time job and then the medical stuff and, this, I am trying my best to balance it all. And I want to give you guys the best stuff as the channel continues to grow. And the amount of growth that we've seen in the last few months has been amazing. And I'm very grateful for it. So with that being said, I want to let you know that I'm going to keep working. I'm going to keep doing it. And if, things do go well with this job and I take it, I'm actually going to have a lot more content to talk about, and I'll be able to do some good from there. So I'm looking forward to it. AA had a stream about trains in his part 2. Had a curious factoid about how steam cars had a water tax on them, thus making them die and make way for gasoline-based cars. Yeah, and I mean, that's essentially what's happening with the transportation secretary proposing a vehicle mileage tax. All of that's going to do is kill your traditional trucking industry. It's going to kill rural drivers driving from the burbs and the rural aspects to cities where they work. So it's going to be a nightmare. And that is their way of cutting off exit. So, and plus, when you add in the trend of electric cars and the fact that, there are already patents in place for electric cars to essentially use the GPS to track them down and repo them, or just to turn off features remotely so you don't even really own your car. Ownership is dead. Vehicles are dying out. Like, it's a nightmare. And so, yeah, like if you drive a car with an internal combustion engine, yeah, better learn how to take care of it and learn how to repair it. So, yeah, it's meant to kill trade and the last remnants of the rural economy. Yeah, in the same way that it's political tit for tat, because the Trump administration got rid of the state and local taxes cap in their tax bill. And so now they're punishing red staters through, destroying the last remnants of our economy and our ability to live. So yeah, they're closing off the exits. So get out now while you still can and learn how to be self-sufficient. Yeah, we're already halfway there to corporate feudalism. Like, the company town is already back in Silicon Valley. But yeah, I need to get ready and head over to Mr. Patriarch's stream. So last but not least, I'm going to shill my subscribe star real quick. So if you're interested, I have a subscribe star. I'm not yet monetized on YouTube, where we haven't gotten the number of view hours yet. But there are 6 of you wonderful people that donate already, and I'm very thankful. And it's going to be, I'm very thankful for the support y'all give me. Even though it's the 6 of you, the fact that you guys think that I'm worth something, it gives me the encouragement to go on. So with that being said, if you're interested and you like this kind of work and you like the conversations I have with various guests, whether it's APACs or, the Great Powers Journal, I plan on having more guests in the future like that. And then, of course, on May 1st, so next Saturday, 2 weeks from now, actually, May 1st, I will be taking care of the book Decline of the West by Oswald Spangler with Oren McIntyre. And so Mark asks, where does the money go towards? So the money goes towards the little bit of money that all of this goes towards. It goes mainly towards just paying off excess. It doesn't go towards anything fun or lavish. It doesn't go into my pockets. It usually goes straight to bills. So I have really good insurance. I take care of my medical needs, but of course, I live in the United States, so not everything is free. And that's where that money goes towards, is that, it pays for a cup of coffee. Sure, it pays for a cup of coffee, but it also pays for, an extra couple of dollars on a medical expense. It helps take care of me, and it helps take care of my ability to stay healthy and to do what I want. I don't pocket, this money doesn't go to like a savings account. This money goes into my checking account, which goes straight off to paying my insurance and things like that. So you guys indirectly help keep me healthy. So I greatly appreciate it. But with that being said, I'm going to head over now to Mr. Patriarch's stream. And not everything is free. There is no such thing as free, but you know what I mean. I live in a place where healthcare is not socialized. But with that being said, I'm going to head over to Mr. Patriarch's stream. We're going to talk about strategy, tactics, and sort of what's been going on in terms of what's been talked about in the world. We know it's not going to a savings account. Those are dying too. You have no idea. I look at my savings and my retirement accounts, and I'm like, these things will eventually be absorbed by some sort of financial regulation in the future, and that terrifies me. But with that being said, I'm gonna take off, and I'll be on Mr. Patriarch's channel. I've linked it in the chat. If you're still interested in hearing what we have to say, by all means, head over there. And until then, guys, I'll have another video out soon. Thank you all so much for stopping by. You've been wonderful. This has been our best stream yet. And you guys take care. Have a great Sunday and be prudent, everybody. I love you guys.